Every morning at exactly 5:43 a.m., before the sun fully rose over the quiet streets of Maple Glen, two dogs could be seen standing perfectly still in the middle of Willow Avenue, staring at the same dark second-floor window, as if they were waiting for someone to appear. People noticed the dogs long before they noticed the man holding their leashes. Rusty, an aging golden retriever with cloudy eyes, never barked. He simply froze in place, ears lifted, tail completely still. Beside him, Milo, the smaller rescue mutt with patched brown fur, would whine softly while scratching at the pavement like he smelled something buried underneath it. Cars slowed down every morning because of them. Joggers crossed the street to avoid them. Some neighbors even began setting their alarms earlier just to watch the strange routine happen again. And every single morning, Caleb Turner let it happen without saying a word. At first, people assumed the dogs were reacting to squirrels or stray cats. But after 3 straight weeks of the exact same behavior at the exact same house, the rumors started. The house itself had been abandoned for years. Its windows were covered with faded curtains, the mailbox hung crooked, and weeds nearly swallowed the front porch steps. Kids in town called it the Hollow House because nobody had seen anyone enter or leave it in almost a decade. Yet Rusty acted like someone was inside. Sometimes the old dog would quietly wag his tail toward the upstairs window. Other times, Milo would suddenly pull so hard on the leash that Caleb nearly lost his balance. What unsettled people most was Caleb's reaction. He never comforted the dogs, never corrected them. He simply stood there staring at the same upstairs window with an expression so heavy and distant that it made strangers uncomfortable. Then one Thursday morning, things became impossible to ignore. Linda Brooks was leaving for her nursing shift when she spotted Caleb kneeling in the middle of the sidewalk outside the Hollow House. Rusty sat beside him, trembling, while Milo scratched frantically at the dead grass near the curb. Caleb looked pale, exhausted, and for the first time, Linda realized the old man was crying. Not quietly either. His shoulders shook as he clutched Rusty's collar with both hands. The dogs refused to move. Linda almost walked over to ask if he needed help, but then she noticed something that made her stop cold. Caleb wasn't looking at the dogs anymore. He was staring directly at the upstairs window, and standing behind the dusty glass, barely visible through the curtain, was the outline of what looked like a small hand pressed against the window from inside the abandoned house. The next morning, 3 police cars were parked outside Caleb Turner's home. By noon that same day, the entire neighborhood had already built its own version of the story. Some people believed Caleb Turner had been sneaking into the abandoned house at night. Others swore the old man was hiding someone inside. But while neighbors whispered behind curtains and police officers quietly searched around the property, Rusty and Milo sat together on Caleb's front porch without making a sound, staring at the empty street as if they were waiting for someone who never came home. Officer Daniel Reed questioned Caleb for nearly an hour that morning, yet the old man barely defended himself. He answered politely, avoided eye contact, and kept glancing toward the dogs every few seconds. When the officers finally left, Rusty slowly walked to Caleb's feet and rested his head against the man's knee. Caleb immediately stopped talking mid-sentence and placed both hands into the old dog's fur like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Linda noticed it from across the street. The dogs were not protecting Caleb. Somehow, it looked like Caleb was the one emotionally surviving because of them. Over the next few days, the morning walks stopped completely. That was when people realized how much the dogs had become part of the town's routine. No one heard Milo's nails clicking against the sidewalks anymore. No one saw Rusty pausing beneath the maple trees near Willow Avenue. The silence unsettled the neighborhood more than anyone expected. Linda could not explain why, but every morning felt strangely empty without them. Then on Sunday afternoon, she spotted Caleb sitting alone behind his house. Beside a rusted chain-link fence, Rusty lay curled beside him under an old blanket even though the weather was warm. The golden retriever looked weaker now. His breathing was slower. Every few minutes, Milo would walk over and gently nudge Rusty's face with his nose as if checking whether he was still awake. Caleb barely moved for almost an hour. He simply sat there holding Rusty's leash loosely in one hand while staring at nothing. Linda felt a knot form in her chest watching from her kitchen window. The dogs no longer seemed strange. They seemed heartbroken. Later that evening, Caleb finally returned to Willow Avenue. But this time, he walked much slower than before. Rusty struggled to keep up, limping slightly as he approached the abandoned house. The moment they reached the sidewalk, both dogs froze again. Milo immediately sat facing the second-floor window while Rusty quietly whimpered under his breath. Caleb closed his eyes tightly, like he already knew what they were looking for. Several neighbors watched from a distance, expecting another strange incident, but nothing happened. No movement appeared behind the curtains. No shadow crossed the glass. After nearly 5 minutes, Caleb whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then, unexpectedly, Rusty let out a soft cry that sounded painfully human. It was not barking. It sounded closer to grief. The old dog slowly walked toward the porch steps of the abandoned house before collapsing onto the wood as if his strength had suddenly disappeared. Caleb rushed forward in panic while Milo began pacing frantically in circles near the front door. And then Linda noticed the detail that made her blood run cold. Resting beside the porch swing was a small red rain boot covered in dust that definitely had not been there the day before. After the discovery of the red rain boot, people in Maple Glen stopped pretending the situation was normal. Parents no longer let their children ride bikes near Willow Avenue, and neighbors began locking their doors earlier at night. But what truly unsettled everyone was not the abandoned house anymore. It was the way Rusty and Milo started behaving after that evening. The next morning, Caleb tried avoiding Willow Avenue completely. For the first time in weeks, he guided the dogs toward the opposite side of town near the railroad tracks. At first, it seemed to work. Rusty walked slowly beside him while Milo sniffed bushes and telephone poles like an ordinary dog again. Caleb even looked calmer. But the moment they reached the corner near the old pharmacy, Milo suddenly froze mid-step. His ears lifted sharply. Then, without warning, he twisted around so violently that the leash slipped from Caleb's hand. The small dog bolted down the sidewalk at full speed. Caleb shouted his name and ran after him, but Milo ignored every command. People watched in shock as the dog raced through traffic, cut across front lawns, and disappeared around the corner, leading directly back to Willow Avenue. By the time Caleb caught up, Milo was already sitting in front of the abandoned house again. But this time was different. The dog was not looking at the upstairs window. He was staring at the front door, completely motionless. Rusty slowly approached beside Caleb, and something about the old retriever's reaction immediately made several neighbors uncomfortable. Rusty lowered himself flat against the sidewalk as if hiding from a storm. His body trembled. Then he began making a strange low sound deep in his throat that nobody had heard before. It was rhythmic, almost like he was trying to mimic a human cry. Caleb's face drained of color. He pulled both dogs away quickly and hurried home without speaking to anyone. That should have been the end of it. But over the following days, the behavior escalated in ways nobody could explain. Milo began waking Caleb every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. by scratching at the bedroom wall instead of the door. Rusty stopped sleeping entirely unless his blanket was placed beside the front window facing Willow Avenue. And every evening just before sunset, both dogs would carry random objects toward Caleb's front porch. Not toys, not sticks, objects. One night, it was a tiny mitten covered in dirt. Another night, it was an old children's crayon with bite marks on it. Then came a faded photograph so damaged by rain that only half a smiling child's face remained visible. Caleb never threw the items away. That frightened Linda more than the dogs themselves. He cleaned each object carefully, placed them inside a cardboard box near his fireplace, and sat beside the box for hours without turning on a single light. Soon people began whispering that the dogs were finding things connected to someone missing. Officer Reed returned twice to question Caleb, but the old man only insisted the dogs were confused because Rusty was aging. Yet even Reed seemed disturbed after seeing the collection growing inside Caleb's house. Then, late one stormy night, everything changed. A loud banging sound echoed across Willow Avenue around 3 a.m. Several neighbors rushed to their windows expecting fallen tree branches from the storm. Instead, they saw Milo repeatedly throwing his body against the front door of the abandoned house, while Rusty stood behind him howling toward the upstairs window. But the strangest part came seconds later when the porch light inside the abandoned house suddenly turned on by itself. The porch light turning on inside the abandoned house changed everything in Maple Glen overnight. By sunrise, the story had spread far beyond Willow Avenue. People no longer viewed Rusty and Milo as grieving dogs with strange habits. Now they saw them as part of something dangerous. Parents whispered that the animals were leading Caleb back to the house for a reason. Others claimed the dogs were trained to retrieve objects connected to whoever had once lived there. Even the local diner stopped talking about weather and football games. Every conversation circled back to Caleb Turner and his dogs. Officer Daniel Reed returned the following morning with 2 additional deputies and a representative from Animal Control named Susan Keller. Unlike the officers, Susan barely looked at Caleb during their conversation. Her eyes stayed fixed on Rusty and Milo. Rusty lay quietly near the porch steps with his head resting on his paws, exhausted from the previous night. But Milo refused to sit still. The smaller dog paced nonstop between Caleb and the street, stopping every few seconds to stare toward Willow Avenue. Before whining under his breath, Susan finally crouched beside Officer Reed and spoke quietly enough that most neighbors could not hear her. But Linda, standing nearby, caught enough words to feel her stomach tighten. Obsessive behavior, environmental trigger, escalating fixation. Susan believed the dogs had developed what she called a trauma response connected to the abandoned house. She warned that if the behavior continued, they could become unpredictable. Caleb immediately objected. For the first time since all of this began, anger flashed across his face. He insisted Rusty and Milo had never hurt anyone. He explained that Milo had been rescued from a flooded roadside shelter years ago and still panicked during storms. He said Rusty was old, confused, and emotionally attached to routines. But the more Caleb tried explaining, the guiltier he sounded to everyone listening. Then Milo made things worse. As Susan stepped closer holding a leash pole, the little dog suddenly darted behind Caleb and began pawing frantically at the back door of the house. Not scratching to escape, scratching to get inside. His cries became louder and sharper with every passing second, until even Rusty slowly stood up and joined him at the door. The sight unsettled the entire street. Both dogs looked terrified, yet somehow desperate to enter the house they already lived in. Susan immediately interpreted the behavior as instability. She warned Officer Reed that the dogs were displaying signs of severe emotional stress and could accidentally hurt themselves or others if left untreated. Caleb's expression completely collapsed when he heard those words. Rusty slowly limped towards Susan, then stopped inches from her boots. For several long seconds, the old retriever simply stared up at her with cloudy, tired eyes. His body shook slightly from exhaustion. Then, in the gentlest motion imaginable, he lowered his head onto her shoe. The entire street fell silent. Even Susan looked uncertain for a moment. Rusty did not appear aggressive. He looked broken. But before anyone could process the moment, Milo suddenly sprinted toward the street again. This time he ran directly to the police cruiser, parked outside Caleb's house, and began clawing desperately at the rear passenger door while barking louder than anyone had ever heard before. Officer Reed rushed after him while neighbors backed away nervously. Then Milo stopped barking completely and pressed his face against the cruiser window, staring at something inside with pure panic. Everyone turned toward the back seat and realized the deputies had already placed Rusty's leash and medical records there. Susan quietly informed Caleb that until further evaluation, both dogs would likely need to be removed from his custody by the end of the day. Caleb Turner barely spoke after hearing the decision. He sat silently on the porch steps while Susan Keller filled out paperwork inside her truck, and Officer Reed remained nearby, watching the dogs carefully. Rusty stayed pressed against Caleb's leg, exhausted and trembling beneath the afternoon heat, while Milo paced nonstop along the edge of the yard like he sensed something terrible was about to happen. Every few minutes, the smaller dog stopped beside the mailbox and sniffed the air toward Willow Avenue before whining softly under his breath. Linda could not stop watching him. Something about Milo's behavior no longer felt random. It felt urgent. Around sunset, Susan finally approached Caleb again and explained that both dogs would be transported the next morning for behavioral evaluation until the situation could be sorted out. Caleb nodded weakly without arguing this time. But the moment Susan clipped a temporary orange intake tag onto Rusty's leash, the old retriever suddenly reacted in a way nobody expected. Rusty slowly stood up, took the tag gently into his mouth, and walked away from the group without pulling or panicking. Everyone assumed the dog was simply confused until he crossed the yard, and stopped directly beside the cardboard box near Caleb's fireplace, visible through the front window. Then Rusty dropped the orange tag into the box beside all the strange objects the dogs had collected over the past weeks. The movement was so deliberate that even Susan frowned. Milo immediately rushed over and began nosing through the box frantically until a folded piece of paper slipped out onto the porch floor. Caleb reacted instantly and tried grabbing it before anyone could see, but a gust of wind carried the paper across the yard toward Linda's feet. She bent down automatically and froze the second she unfolded it. It was not a note. It was a child's hand-drawn map made with faded crayons. At the top, written in shaky, uneven letters, were the words, "Me and Rusty's secret route." Linda's chest tightened. The map showed tiny sketches of sidewalks, trees, and mailboxes around Maple Glen. And near the center was a crude drawing of the abandoned house on Willow Avenue, circled several times in red. But that was not the detail that disturbed her most. Near the bottom corner, almost too faded to read, was a sentence written carefully beside a paw print traced in marker. "Rusty always knows when I am scared." Linda slowly looked up at the old retriever, standing silently beside the box. Rusty was not staring at the abandoned house now. He was staring at the map in her hands. Officer Reed stepped closer and gently asked where the drawing came from. But Caleb immediately took the paper back and folded it tightly against his chest. His eyes filled with panic. He insisted it was old and meaningless. Yet for the first time since this began, Reed did not look convinced. Neither did Linda. As the evening grew darker, Susan continued preparing the transport crates beside her truck while neighbors slowly returned indoors. But Linda could not stop thinking about the map, especially one detail she had noticed only seconds before Caleb folded it away. Along the side of the crayon drawing, there were tiny dates written beside several locations around town. Most were smudged beyond recognition, except for one. The date beside the abandoned house matched the exact night the porch light mysteriously turned on by itself. Later that night, long after Caleb and the dogs disappeared inside the house, Linda quietly drove to the public records office near City Hall and asked the night clerk for every archived document connected to the abandoned property on Willow Avenue. The records office closed at midnight, but Linda Brooks remained seated alone beneath the flickering desk lamp while old property files covered the table around her. Most of the documents connected to the abandoned house were ordinary tax reports and ownership transfers stretching back decades. Then she found a thin yellow folder buried beneath the others with a faded label that read, "Emergency Welfare Request." Inside was a report filed almost 7 years earlier by a school counselor named Denise Harper. Linda's pulse quickened as she read the first paragraph. The report described concerns about a young girl named Emma Turner who frequently arrived at school exhausted and emotionally distressed after caring for her seriously ill mother at home. Attached to the report was a handwritten note from the counselor mentioning something unusual. Student repeatedly insists her dog alerts adults whenever mother stops responding. Linda frowned in confusion and turned the page. Another document explained that emergency responders had once been dispatched to the Turner residence after a neighbor reported hearing a dog scratching continuously against a front door for nearly 2 hours. According to the report, paramedics arrived just in time to help Emma's mother during a severe medical episode while Emma was trapped alone inside the house. The dog's name listed in the report was Rusty. Linda felt chills spread across her arms. Suddenly the map, the collected objects, the desperate scratching. None of it felt random anymore. Before she could process the thought fully, her phone rang. It was Officer Reed. His voice sounded tense. Susan Keller had already returned to Caleb's house with transport crates and paperwork. The dogs were being taken within the hour. Linda rushed out of the records office and drove through the empty streets of Maple Glen faster than she should have. Rain hammered against her windshield as she turned onto Caleb's road. By the time she arrived, Susan was already leading Rusty slowly toward the truck while Milo barked frantically from the porch. Caleb stood nearby completely defeated, too emotionally drained to argue anymore. Linda jumped out of her car and shouted for everyone to stop. Officer Reed stepped forward immediately, but Linda shoved the yellow folder into his hands and told him to read the counselor's report. As Reed scanned the pages, Milo suddenly stopped barking. The little dog turned toward the street instead. Then he ran. Not away from the house this time. Toward Willow Avenue. Officer Reed instinctively followed while Linda and Caleb ran behind him through the rain-soaked sidewalks. Milo sprinted directly to the abandoned house and disappeared around the side yard. When they reached the backyard fence moments later, they found the dog clawing wildly at a small wooden cellar door almost completely hidden beneath overgrown vines. Caleb froze the second he saw it. His face turned ghostly pale. Slowly, trembling, he admitted something he had never told anyone. Years ago, after Emma's mother passed away, Emma used to hide inside that cellar whenever panic attacks overwhelmed her. Rusty had always been the one who found her first. Officer Reed forced the swollen cellar door open while rainwater poured down the concrete steps. Everyone expected to find nothing except dust and old storage boxes. Instead, the beam of Reed's flashlight landed on dozens of carefully preserved drawings covering the cellar walls. Crayon maps, paw prints, dates, messages, every single one addressed to Rusty. At the center of the room sat a battery-powered lantern connected to an old motion timer. The exact same light neighbors saw turning on upstairs. Then Linda noticed something else sitting beside the lantern. A stack of unopened birthday cards addressed to Emma Turner. The newest card had been placed there only 3 days earlier. Caleb collapsed to his knees as the truth finally hit everyone at once. Rusty and Milo had never been leading people toward danger. For years, they had been guarding the only place where Caleb still spoke to his daughter after losing her. For several long seconds, nobody inside the cellar spoke. Rainwater dripped steadily down the concrete stairs while Officer Reed slowly lowered his flashlight toward the floor, unable to take his eyes off the drawings covering the walls. Some were simple sketches of sidewalks and trees around Maple Glen. Others showed Rusty lying beside a little girl beneath stars colored in purple crayon. But the older drawings hurt the most. Emma had drawn Rusty beside hospital beds, beside medicine bottles, beside windows marked with storm clouds. In almost every picture, the dog stood between her and something frightening. Linda suddenly remembered the nights Milo scratched at Caleb's walls exactly at 2:17 a.m. She remembered Rusty freezing beneath the upstairs window every morning. The collected objects, the maps, the porch light, none of it had been random behavior from unstable animals. The dogs had been repeating Emma's old routines all along, desperately trying to lead someone back to the one place Caleb could not emotionally face alone anymore. Caleb remained collapsed near the bottom step with his face buried against Rusty's neck. The old retriever did not move. He simply leaned weakly against Caleb like he had been waiting years for this moment. Milo slowly walked around the cellar, sniffing Emma's drawings one by one before curling up beside a dusty sleeping bag in the corner. Linda's throat tightened when she realized the fabric still carried tiny dog hairs woven into it. Emma had hidden there with Rusty countless times during storms, panic attacks, and lonely nights after her mother became sick. Suddenly Caleb's strange routines no longer looked unsettling. They looked heartbreaking. Officer Reed quietly picked up one of the birthday cards near the lantern. The envelope had never been sealed. Inside was a handwritten message from Caleb dated only 3 days earlier. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Rusty still waits for you every morning." Reed stopped reading midway through the sentence and lowered the card slowly, visibly shaken. Upstairs, neighbors had gathered silently outside the cellar entrance after hearing the commotion. Susan Keller stood near the doorway holding Rusty's transport paperwork against her chest. She looked completely different now. No authority, no certainty, just guilt. When Rusty slowly struggled to his feet and climbed halfway toward the stairs, Susan instinctively stepped backward as if she did not deserve to touch him anymore. The old dog paused beside her, trembling from exhaustion. Then, incredibly, he nudged his head gently against her hand anyway. Susan's composure finally broke. She covered her mouth and turned away, crying silently into the rain while Milo climbed the stairs and sat directly beside the unopened transport crate waiting outside. The little dog stared at it for several seconds before lowering his head onto the metal door as if he understood exactly what almost happened. Around them, neighbors began realizing the same terrible truth. They had spent days treating the dogs like a threat, when in reality the animals had been carrying the emotional weight of a grieving family completely alone. Linda suddenly remembered how Rusty had dropped the orange intake tag into Emma's memory box. He had not been confused. He had been protecting the only things left connected to her. Officer Reed walked slowly towards Susan and removed the transport forms from her hands before folding them in half. Then he looked at Caleb and said quietly that no one was taking the dogs anywhere. But what happened next left the entire street in tears. As Caleb finally stood up beside Rusty, the old retriever gently picked up one of Emma's faded crayon drawings in his mouth and carried it carefully upstairs into the rain as though he was finally bringing her memory back home where it belonged. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn, but nobody on Willow Avenue went back to normal afterward. By morning, something quiet had changed throughout Maple Glen. Front porch lights remained on longer than usual. Cars slowed near Caleb Turner's house instead of speeding past it. And for the first time in years, neighbors who had barely spoken to Caleb before began walking up his driveway carrying things in their hands. One woman brought fresh dog blankets still folded in store packaging. A teenager arrived with a bag of tennis balls for Milo. Someone else quietly left homemade chicken broth beside the porch steps after hearing Rusty had stopped eating properly days earlier. No speeches, no pity, just people trying in small, awkward ways to repair what they suddenly realized had been broken long before the rumors ever started. Caleb struggled to understand it at first. He stood frozen near his front window watching strangers kneel beside Rusty gently instead of backing away from him in fear. The old retriever looked exhausted after the previous night, yet something in his expression seemed softer now, less tense, as if the constant pressure he carried had finally eased. Milo reacted first. The little rescue dog cautiously approached each visitor one at a time, sniffing their hands carefully before leading them toward the cardboard memory box near the fireplace. At first, people did not understand why he kept doing it. Then Linda noticed something remarkable. Every time someone paused to look through Emma's drawings or read one of the birthday cards aloud, Milo stopped pacing. Completely. The frantic, anxious energy that had controlled him for weeks would suddenly disappear for a few moments at a time. It was almost as though the dog had not been trying to expose a secret at all. He had been trying to make sure Emma was not forgotten. By afternoon, Officer Reed returned carrying several weatherproof storage bins from the hardware store. Without saying much, he helped Caleb carefully preserve every drawing, map, and letter from the cellar before moisture could destroy them. Susan Keller arrived later with Dr. Harper Wells, the local veterinarian. But this time there were no transport crates in the back of her vehicle. Instead, Harper quietly examined Rusty on Caleb's porch while neighbors sat nearby, in complete silence. The veterinarian eventually explained that Rusty's body was simply aging faster than Caleb had admitted to himself. Arthritis, fatigue, a weakening heart. Nothing dangerous, nothing unstable. Just an old dog carrying years of emotional routines longer than anyone realized. Caleb lowered his head when he heard those words, and for a moment Linda thought he might completely fall apart again. But then something unexpected happened. Milo disappeared into the house and returned dragging Emma's faded purple blanket slowly across the floor. The small dog struggled with the fabric until he finally dropped it directly beside Rusty. The old retriever immediately rested his head against it with a long, tired sigh unlike anything anyone had heard from him before. Not grief. Relief. Linda quietly knelt beside Caleb and suggested something simple. Instead of sealing the cellar forever or pretending none of this existed, the neighborhood could restore it properly. Not as a place of fear or rumors, but as Emma's memory room. A safe place. Somewhere Rusty and Milo no longer had to guard alone. By sunset, neighbors were already cleaning debris from the cellar steps together while Caleb sat on the porch watching in disbelief. Rusty remained wrapped in Emma's blanket nearby, his cloudy eyes following the movement peacefully instead of anxiously for the first time in weeks. Then, just before darkness settled over Willow Avenue, Milo curled himself tightly against Rusty's side and finally fell asleep without waking once to check the upstairs window. Autumn arrived quietly in Maple Glen that year. The trees along Willow Avenue turned deep gold and orange, and for the first time in a very long while, people no longer crossed the street to avoid Caleb Turner or his dogs. Instead, every Saturday morning, neighbors gathered beside the restored cellar behind the abandoned house carrying folding chairs, coffee cups, and sometimes new drawings made by local children for the memory wall inside. Nobody officially planned it. The tradition simply happened on its own. The cellar no longer felt cold or forgotten. Soft lights now lined the concrete stairs, the damp walls had been repaired, and Emma's crayon maps were carefully framed behind glass so they would never fade again. At the center of the room sat the old lantern beside a wooden sign carved by one of the neighbors that read Emma's Corner. But the detail visitors remembered most was always Rusty. The aging retriever still walked there every morning beside Caleb and Milo, though his steps had become slower with each passing week. Yet the moment he entered the cellar, something in him always changed. His breathing steadied. His tail gave small, gentle movements. Sometimes he would rest beside Emma's drawings for hours while Milo quietly guarded the staircase above him like he understood this place mattered more than anyone could explain. Caleb changed too. The old man who once avoided eye contact now stayed after the Saturday gatherings, talking softly with neighbors long after sunset. He shared stories about Emma teaching Rusty to follow hand-drawn treasure maps around town. He admitted she believed dogs remembered feelings better than humans did. People forget moments, Caleb told Linda one evening while watching Rusty sleep beside the lantern. But dogs remember how someone made them feel forever. Those words stayed with her. Weeks later, Officer Reed quietly removed the final police tape from the abandoned property. No one complained when the house officially became a small community memory space funded by donations from the town itself. Children left dog treats near Emma's drawings. Visitors added photographs of pets they had loved and lost. Even Susan Keller returned regularly after work with fresh blankets for Rusty. She never spoke much about the night. She almost took the dogs away. But every time she entered the cellar, Rusty still greeted her gently with a slow wag of his tail, as if he had forgiven her long before she forgave herself. Then one cold November morning, Maple Glen woke to the first snowfall of the year. Caleb followed the familiar trail of paw prints behind his house and found Rusty resting peacefully inside Emma's corner beneath the purple blanket Milo had dragged across the floor weeks earlier. The old retriever looked completely calm. One paw rested lightly against Emma's favorite crayon drawing, while Milo lay curled tightly beside him, refusing to leave his side. Caleb sat there for a very long time without speaking. Not broken, not alone, just grateful. Later that afternoon, the entire neighborhood gathered quietly outside the cellar entrance while snow fell softly around Willow Avenue. No sirens, no rumors, no fear. Only silence and respect for the old dog who had spent years protecting memories nobody else knew how to carry. Before leaving, Caleb carefully placed Rusty's leash beside Emma's drawings and whispered something only Milo heard. That evening, for the very first time since Emma's passing, the upstairs window of the abandoned house stayed dark, because the dog who had been guarding the grief inside it could finally rest.